The Holy Gospel is written in the 14th chapter of St. Mark, beginning at the 25th verse. Now large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and he turned and said to them, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even his life itself, cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not first sit down and estimate the cost, to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all to see it will begin to ridicule him, saying, 'This fellow began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king, going out to wage war against another king, will not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes with 20,000? If he cannot, then, while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So therefore, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions." Here ends the gospel for the day. Please be seated. This is the first time in my 60-some years of ministry that I've preached on Philemon. You probably don't even remember there was a book of the Bible. And I'm sure none of you could quote anything significant from the book of Philemon. There is some talk even by biblical scholars of why Philemon is even in the Bible. It was written by Paul. It was written by Paul from prison. But contrary to the other letters that he wrote, which were written to churches at Corinth, the letter to the Corinthians, Galatia, the letter to the Galatians, and on, most of Paul's letters were written to churches about church matters, and they were to be read to congregations as a part of the regular service, directing congregations on how they should act and how should they practice their Christianity in terms of the community that they were a part of. What Philemon is a letter. It's a personal letter from Paul to another Christian friend of his named Philemon. It was not considered to be generally read to a congregation. It was just a personal thing between Paul and Philemon. For some reason, it was preserved over the years because the letter was given by Paul in prison to Onesimus, who was the slave, the servant of Philemon, and he could have easily thrown it in file 9 or whatever you call it, delivering it back. He could have run off and not done what he was supposed to. We would have never seen the letter, and why it existed after Philemon got it, we don't know. And then when I looked at it, it was kind of interesting because it seems to apply to the meeting we're having after this church service. Let me relate what's happening in the letter to Philemon. Philemon had a slave. His name was Onesimus. And one of the things that this slave did was just deserted his master. And it seems from the writing in the letter, it seems like he might have stolen something from his master when he decided to run away. One of the things that he knew was that he was a friend of Paul. He knew that Paul was in prison, and he went to visit him, and probably talked about his relationship with his good friend, Philemon. Now, we got to suppose that Philemon probably wasn't very nice to this fellow. He treated them all very much in a derogatory way. Otherwise, Onesimus would have not risked his life running away. But he met with Paul, and one of the things that happened when he was with Paul is that he was converted to Christianity. He became a member of the brotherhood. And what he did is he served Paul very faithfully. Paul came to really like him. He wanted him to stay with him, but there was one problem. Onesimus was a piece of property, and it belonged to his friend. And so Paul decides that he has to obey Roman law, and he sends Onesimus back. He says, you got to go back. Now, he says, I'm going to write a letter, but you got to go back to your master. Now, this takes a great deal of faith on the part of Paul, because what was the penalty for running away from your master? One of the penalties was you could submit them to the authority, and they could punish him. If the slave came back, the master had every right to treat him any way he wanted to, in any derogatory way he wanted to. Not only that, but if he decided that he was really upset, he could have him killed. That was the law. So Paul is looking at this, and Paul knows Roman law really well. That's what he was. He was a legal man. But he says, I'm going to trust you, and I'm going to trust my fellow Christian Philemon. So I'm going to send you a letter. And I'm going to send you back because that's what I'm supposed to do. But I'm going to write and say, I really would like you to let him stay with me, because he's been a great help to me, and he has proved already that he's not very faithful to you. So, Onesimus has options too. He can take this letter, and he's got to understand that there could be penalties. But he's believing both in Paul and Philemon that he's going to get the best of it, and his life is going to be okay. He could have thrown the letter away and just taken off in the other direction, but he decides to do what is legal and go back and have it done. How interesting. Paul is testing Onesimus. He's also testing his friend Philemon. And what he says to Philemon is, he's coming back to you. I would just soon you keep him here, but he's yours. But look at him a little different way than just as a slave, because now he's a part of the brotherhood of Christianity. Look at him as a brother. Just look at him as a brother. What is interesting is Paul doesn't define that at all. He simply lets Philemon operate the way he feels is a part of his Christian faith. He doesn't tell him to have him punished, but he certainly doesn't tell him to let him go free either. He says, that's up to you. Christian life is lived up individually, and I can't judge you on what reaction you're going to take. Now he goes back. We don't exactly know what the outcome was, but it appears that Philemon took him back. He retained his position. Paul said he would make up for anything that he might have stolen, so call the table even. Said, I wouldn't do that for everybody, but I'm going to do it in this case. Paul gives them no instructions other than to say, treat him as a brother, and you got to figure out what that means to you. One of the things that bothers a lot of scholars is that Paul does not speak anything against slavery. He says, wasn't Paul against, they say, well, isn't Paul against slavery? And it appears that Paul didn't like this institution very well. One of the things he understood was that it was an essential part of both Roman and Greek culture. He said, I don't like the office of slavery, the position of slavery, but I don't like insurrection and total chaos either. That is not a suitable reaction. All I can say is when he comes back, look at him in a different way, as a brother. And you treat him as a brother who disobeyed the law, a brother who wasn't exactly kind to you. But it's your decision of how that comes to fruition in your life. The point that we take from this is that the problem, or that the mission of the church is not to make bold declarations of public policy, but it is to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ in terms of what he has done for you and let you work out your particular ethics the way you feel that it is best in your relationship between you and God. The problem with making wide, sweeping generalizations is that there is diversity in the way people treat others and what they think is the proper way. And you must live in that kind of tension. But the law is there to give structure, and we are simply there to care and love people and let the light shine and love anybody in the best way we know how. That seems so loose, but it's the way it must be. One of the things that we opposed in the Reformation was the idea that the Pope was infallible, and that when he made a statement, everybody in the church had to obey that certain rule. That's a nice way to function, because then we have a rule and we can just abide by it, and we can be unkind with that rule or we can be kind with it. But we can justify some of our worst behavior on a rule that was meant for a good purpose, but we use it for an improper purpose. Luther said the Christian is a free person. He's not bound except by his conscience to do what he feels is right. But one of the things that Luther did not say was that he needed to disobey the public officials, because they give us structure, and we need that. And he then, after the Peasants' Revolution, when they went on a big ransacking of all the churches and the Catholic clergy in Germany, he felt bad about what he had even done, because they had mishandled and misread what he said. We don't destroy other people. We are loving, we are kind, we operate in the best way that we know how. And yet we do it in the framework of a society that gives us structure that doesn't lead to insurrection. Now, you can interpret this any way that you want. But again, I emphasize that the decision for what you do, right or wrong, is not written in some book or in some confession of a church. It is written in your heart of how you understand your relationship with Jesus Christ, and you have to go with it. If you differ from somebody else, it's okay. You live together and you love those even who you differ with. Interesting text. Not what we'd expect from Paul. We'd expect Paul to tell you exactly what you had to do. And yet Paul, in this intensely personal matter, said, it's up to you. You determine where you're going to go with it, Philemon, but treat him as a brother. And if we could take that in our own lives, and as we look down on people, or we feel inferior because we are people that we think are superior, remember the words of Paul. Just remember, we're all brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ. And you take it from there. Amen.